Law at Work is sponsored by Perrott for Niekerk, Woodhouse, Matyolo, leading labour law specialists representing businesses throughout South and Southern Africa, as well as Case Law, the quick, fast and easy labour law search engine.
Many employers find it difficult to determine the nature of the employment relationship because of the various categories of employee. With us in the studio is Rob Perrott, partner at Perrott for Niekerk, Woodhouse, Matyolo. Welcome, Rob.
Hi, Simon.
Rob, I understand that the definition of employee is the subject of much controversy. One would imagine that in terms of labour law, it's probably one of the easier things to understand. Why would there be this controversy around the subject?
I think in the first place, Simon, one's got to accept that labour law is designed to protect the rights of employees in the workplace. And so from that point of view, employees are the cornerstone of certainly our individual labour laws. The definition itself is relatively simple. An employee is someone who works for another in return for payment in money or in kind. But conventionally in South Africa, our employee definition has had to exclude independent contractors because there is a class of contract that is different from employment, but drawing the distinction has proved immensely difficult.
Rob, the concept of the independent contractor, a lot of organisations seem to be relying on these people more and more. Could you elaborate on that concept?
I think the most important part is to understand that many organisations rely on independent contractors in the hope of avoiding the impact of employment laws. Many persons as employees are happy to contract as independent contractors due to a perceived tax advantage. In other words, if it is an employee, the employer must deduct PAYE at source at the time that remuneration is paid. So from an independent contractor point of view, they would rather not have money deducted at source but deal with their own tax affairs. From the government's point of view, there's the question of regulation. Labour law is about regulation in the workplace. So ensuring that people who are otherwise employees are captured in that brings about this tension. So it's an issue that our courts have often had to face in dealing with whether a person is an employee or a true independent contractor.
Okay, now how would they do that? How would the court determine who is an employee?
So there's no statutory definition of independent contractor as the case with an employee. So over time they've developed a test, and the test in essence is to go beyond the written contract, because it's very easy to conclude a written contractor that has independent contractor stamped all over it, and to look at the nature of the relationship. And they apply a number of factors. They look at control, they look at whether the person does work for other persons, whether the tools of the trade are provided by the employer, etc., to determine behind the contract whether this is an employment contract or a true independent contractor relationship.
This is quite different then from other areas of law where the contracts seem to take precedence over everything else.
Absolutely. In most areas of law, the written word is sacrosanct, but in particularly labour law, in the area of an independent contractor, a test being developed that goes beyond the pure written word.
Okay. We'll come back to that in a second. In line with independent contractors, I believe that a lot of employers use the services of labour brokers or temporary employment agents as they're known now. Could you describe the obligations that fall upon those employees and employers?
In terms of our labour law, the employer of persons provided to a client by a labour broker is the labour broker, or as our law more commonly puts it, a temporary employment service. So the primary employer is the labour broker. This is attractive for many companies, entities in the country, because they outsource key functions and they use the services of temporary employment services or labour brokers. I think in the hope that they're then not saddled with the labour law obligations, etc. But of course, the law has recognised that such a relationship is often open to abuse, and there's joint and several liability built into many areas, particularly with respect to minimum standards legislation. In other words, where a recalcitrant labour broker operates out of the boot of his car and things go wrong, he disappears off into the sunset, the employees may have a claim, for example, for severance pay against the client or the customer.
Okay. In terms of let's say a dismissal, if an employee was dismissed for misconduct, say, would the client, the employer of the labour from the labour broker, be liable for that? Would they be drawn into the CCMA action?
There's a lot of consideration at the moment at extending that liability to the customer, but at present there's not joint and several liability in respect of dismissal.
Okay.
So the integrity of the labour broker as employer remains from a dismissal or unfair dismissal point of view.
We obviously live in a changing world. People are taking on new roles, working in different ways. How has that definition of employee related to that? How does it handle that?
I think it's created problems in the sense that there are so many forms now of atypical work, in the temporary work, part-time work, piecework, employees who are employed at home, that regulation from a government perspective is becoming increasingly difficult to ensure that employers comply with minimum standards legislation in the form, whether it's leave pay or severance pay, etc. So the definition is fine, but those grey areas that have been created by these new forms of work do create problems. One of the ways that they have addressed it over the past few years is to introduce a range of presumptions. In other words, if certain factors are present, then there is a presumption that the relationship is one of employment. So, for example, if the employee works for one person for 40 hours or more a month, or there's a question of control exercised over that person, then there's a presumption of employment. That, of course, only applies to persons who earn below the current minimum threshold of 115,000 rand. But that presumption then helps in the context that the employer or the company must prove that the relationship is not one of employment. So there is a presumption to assist in that area.
Excellent. Rob, thank you very much. That was very informative. Join us again next week when we debate the use of foreign labour.
Law at Work is sponsored by Perrott van Niekerk, Woodhouse, Matyolo, leading labour law specialists representing businesses throughout South and Southern Africa, as well as Case Law, the quick, fast and easy labour law search engine. As well as Case Law, the quick, fast and easy labour law search engine.